Welcome to SEPA on this gloriously rainy, windy day. Welcome to all of you. I'm Paige Fortna. I'm the director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, which is SEPA. And I know that this panel comes at the end of a very long day for all of you and that we are the last thing standing between you and the happy hour, so we will keep this lively and on time. I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm a political scientist. I concentrate on international relations and international security. My research has focused on war termination and the durability of peace, the effectiveness of peacekeeping, terrorism and civil wars, and increasingly turning to the international politics of climate change. I teach courses on all of those things, as well as international politics in general and research methods. My teaching line is actually in the School of Arts and Sciences here at Columbia, but as director of the Saltzman Institute, I'm also part of SEPA. And I think that's actually one of the things that I think is most valuable about SEPA. And I sort of am an example of the way in which SEPA is really closely connected to the academic departments, the political science department, the economics department, as well as other social science departments. Econ, Poli-Sci, and SEPA are all in the same building, the International Affairs Building. In Poli-Sci, we get very offended if people refer to it as the SEPA building, because it's not just the SEPA building, we're there too. But what that means is that there's a much closer connection between the academic departments and the policy school than there is at a lot of other institutions. I've spent time at other institutions, I won't name names, where there's a real divide and a kind of mutual disdain between the academic folks and the policy folks, which I think is unfortunate. And here that's not true. I mean, partly it's just the geography that we're all in the same building, but also those of us on the academic side really value policy relevant work. And in my experience, the folks at SEPA really value the academic rigor that the academic departments bring. Lots of faculty have joint appointments across an academic department and SEPA. Again, we're all in the same building. Students cross-register. SEPA students take my classes in political science. Poli-Sci, master's and PhD students take SEPA courses. The fact that we're all there together means it's easy to see what's going on in the departments, go to talks and events across the two. So there's a really much closer connection, which I think really strengthens both SEPA and the academic department. So that's my little plug for why you should come to SEPA, even though you're here on a rainy day in which we don't look our best, I don't think. I'm thrilled to introduce today Ambassador John J. Sullivan. He is a Carnegie Distinguished Fellow with SEPA's rather new Institute of Global Politics, which I think you've been hearing about some today. He is a former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to Russia, as well as a partner in Mayer Brown, and he co-leads the firm's national security practice. He's frequently quoted in the media. Apparently he's going to be talking today about Havana syndrome, so if anybody wants to ask about that in the Q&A, you're welcome to, and a contributor to CBS News. He's worked extensively on trade and commerce, excuse me, and issues that are important to multinational companies doing business around the world, including as U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce. His career spans 4 decades in the public sector and private law practice. He served under 5 presidents in prominent diplomatic and legal positions. Most recently, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2019 to 2022, a period spanning both the Trump and Biden administrations. Before that, he was the Deputy Secretary of State and served as Acting Secretary of State for several weeks in 2018. Previously, he was appointed by President Obama to chair the U.S.-Iraq Business Dialogue. He's held senior positions in the Department of Justice, Defense, and Commerce in 2 prior administrations. As you can tell, the CV is very impressive and goes on and on. Importantly, he has Columbia Blue in his veins, having received his law degree here at the Columbia Law School, and I understand is also the parent of a SEPA alum, so he's familiar with SEPA. And last but not least, he has a new book coming out, Midnight in Moscow, which I understand will hit bookstores towards the end of the summer?
August 6th.
August 6th, okay, so you can keep an eye out for that. So I'll start us off with some questions for the ambassador to get the conversation going, and then I'll open it up to questions from all of you. And as I said, we will end promptly at 3:30 so that we don't get in the way of happy hour. So Welcome, Ambassador to SIPA, and
Thank you.
I know you've been here for a bit. I thought I'd start with a question about, that I think is probably on everybody's minds, about Russia and Ukraine. As the conflict grinds now into its third year, I'm curious looking forward, how you see it ending. When and how? Will it be some sort of formal negotiated settlement, and if so, what might that look like? Will it be kind of one of these conflicts that sort of fizzles out and just ends in a frozen conflict like we've seen in the region, where there's no official peace settlement, but the actual fighting more or less stops, or something in between there? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my views have changed over time because the conflict has changed over time, right? In 2022, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine at the end of February, and senior Russian officers, both military officers and officers in the FSB, which is the Russian security service, were advised to bring their dress uniforms with them when they entered Ukrainian territory, so that they would be prepared for the victory celebration and victory parade in Kyiv after the victory was achieved. They thought 10 days, 2 weeks, and it turned out to be, for a variety of reasons, not as easy as the Russians thought it was going to be. And I'm happy to talk about that, about our assessment, the US government's assessment of what we thought the Russians were capable of, what we thought the Ukrainians were capable of. But the Russians really committed some egregious mistakes, and were not organized to invade a country of the size of Ukraine with the troops and other material that they committed. They tried to seize Kyiv. They were beaten back by fierce Ukrainian resistance, and sort of in the May-June timeframe in 2022, the war, they seized this city on the Sea of Azov, Mariupol, which is an important port, and it was one of their few accomplishments in the spring. But over the summer of 2022, this is a couple of years ago now, the war was in a little bit of a stalemate, and then the Ukrainians started an offensive in August, gathering momentum into September, October, November, and all of the Russian gains, many of the Russian gains in eastern Ukraine, around Kharkiv, the important oblast capital, the only major city that the Russians seized at the initial stage of the invasion, Kherson, the Ukrainians drove them out. And it looked like the Russians were on their heels, and the Ukrainians the winter set in, the offensive, it slowed and ultimately halted. The Russians mounted a defense that stopped the Ukrainians, but it's from 2022 into 2023, the expectations were then raised. Boy, maybe the Ukrainians can really push the Russians out, not only of the territory that they had seized in February and March of 2022, but the territory that Russia had seized in 2014-15 in the eastern Donbass and Crimea. The Ukrainian offensive in 2023, not nearly as successful as the Ukrainian offensive in 2022. Massive casualties on both sides. The human suffering in this conflict is, in Europe, if we focus just on conflicts in Europe, the only equivalent, you have to go back to World War II. I mean, there are approximately 15 million Ukrainians who were driven from their homes and became internally displaced persons, or became refugees and had to leave their country. An unknown number, a huge number of civilians killed, maimed. It's of staggering scale, the war that Russia unleashed on Ukraine. But it froze into a stalemate in 2023. There have been marginal gains recently by the Russians, but they're not constituted now. Their military isn't constituted now to accomplish what Putin originally set out to do, which was sack Kyiv, remove the Zelensky administration, and the terms the Russians used were denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. My opinion, and I'm not a military expert, but I know a lot of folks in government who are, the Russians aren't constituted right now to do that. For example, the Russians don't fly a lot of their combat aircraft over Ukraine because Russia never got control of the airspace over Ukraine. And the inability of the Russians, what in the United States we call the combined arms doctrine, so that land forces, tanks, infantry personnel, combined with aircraft, drones, missiles, naval assets, all operate in sync. So that, and the United States has worked very hard on this, so our military is, it's called combined arms warfare, so that we have one common objective. The Russian military operates more on a World War II style footing, with ground operations not coordinated with air operations, and there were almost as many Russian aircraft shot down with friendly fire from Russian forces than there were Russian aircraft shot down by Ukrainians. So, long-winded answer to a short, simple question. Stalemate now. What happens next? Who knows? In some ways, the answer depends more on what happens in Washington than what happens in the Donbass or southern Ukraine. If Ukraine continues to be supplied with arms and materiel, my prediction is a frozen conflict. It could go on for a long time. And the conflict itself, which started in 2014, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that people were getting killed all the time, not just on the line of contact in the Donbass. This is 14, 15, 16, 17, when I started visiting Kyiv in 17, 18, and 19. Deaths all the time, including horrific civilian casualties. Commercial airliner shot down by the Russian-supported forces. So this was an ongoing conflict that got jacked up on steroids in February of 2022 by Vladimir Putin. And one thing I am confident of is he has not and will not surrender his goals for Ukraine, which, as he phrases it, are to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. And what that means is eliminating the democratic government in Kyiv and eliminating the Ukrainian people's ability to decide for themselves what they want to do with their country, with its security posture, its orientation east or west, EU, closer economic cooperation with Russia. The Kremlin wants to decide that for them, and I think ultimately what Putin would like would be, at a minimum, the relationship that Russia now has with Belarus. They call it a union state. It's really, they use the word vassal, which I like. They talk about NATO and U.S. allies, and they say they're all our vassals, the United States. We have vassals. Well, Belarus is a Russian vassal, and they want Ukraine to be a Russian vassal, all part of what Putin calls his Ruski Mir, his Russian world. So this conflict isn't going to end. If it ends, it will only be because the West didn't support Kyiv, and that over time the Russians were able to wear down the Ukrainians, which would be tragic and horrific for Ukraine, but an enormous blow to security and stability in Europe, and most importantly, to the United States.
Thanks. You started your answer to that question with the intelligence failure on the part of Russia to understand what Ukraine's defense would be like and how easy it would be to march into Kyiv and declare victory. So I want to ask you about another more recent intelligence failure around the terrorist attack that we saw in Moscow recently. And we've learned some about how U.S. intelligence was operating there, what we share with Russians and what we don't. So I'd like to ask you how you think that intelligence failure happened, and also what you make of the Russian response to the attack.
So I'll take the second part of the question first because it's easiest to deal with. It all comes back to what Putin's priority is, which is prevailing in the war in Ukraine. So he's desperate, contrary to fact, to blame this on Ukraine and the United States. That ultimately, and the Russians have said this for years, that the United States created ISIS, which is not true. And they're trying to portray the Ukrainians as ultimately, in the United States, as ultimately supporting terrorist attacks in Russia, including this particular horrific attack in Moscow. My background on this is really as deputy secretary. We had a counterterrorism dialogue with the Russian government. We met several times. I, as deputy secretary, met with a deputy foreign minister, Oleg Siromolotov, who had a background in first KGB, FSB, and about 8-9 years ago went over to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to deal with counterterrorism issues. It was, from the United States' perspective, a complete waste of time. We never got, through that dialogue, information about terrorist activity in the United States that we could actually take action on. The only example I can cite is prior to the Boston Marathon, and this is not through the counterterrorism dialogue, but prior to the Boston Marathon bombing, the Russian government did provide information about the two individuals, the Tsarnaev brothers. Got some interest in the FBI. We asked for follow-up to justify a further criminal investigation. We didn't get it, and the Boston Marathon bombing happened. The United States, and Putin has said this, the United States has provided actionable intelligence to disrupt terrorist plots in Moscow, two in particular in St. Petersburg, while I was deputy secretary, both of which the United States provided the intelligence that the Russians used to stop. One was a terrorist attack on a cathedral in St. Petersburg, and there was going to be another mass attack. Both times, President Putin reached out, called the President of the United States, in this case Trump, to thank the United States for the information that we provided. The counterterrorism dialogue, never, what it was an opportunity for the Russians to say, we're responsible players on the global stage, and we're having a counterterrorism dialogue with the United States. They wanted the pictures of a meeting with US government officials, but they never provided the information that was necessary for us to justify continuing that dialogue, particularly when they would make public statements that said the United States created ISIS and is really responsible for terrorism around the world. I conveyed the message to the Russian government, to the foreign minister himself, Foreign Minister Lavrov, that the United States would no longer participate in the counterterrorism dialogue because of how the Russians conducted themselves and what they said about the United States. But, an important but, we would continue to provide, when we had it, actionable intelligence that would disrupt a terrorist attack, because the United States, and I said myself personally, I don't want to see innocent blood on the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, or any other Russian city, and we will continue to provide that information. We did. We followed through on the pledge that the United States made to always provide that information. Now, what the Russians do with it, difficult to say, because I've seen this in a number of instances where their public statements, if their thinking is the United States controls ISIS and that ISIS is a tool of the United States, they're not going to be effective in disrupting an actual ISIS plot in the Russian Federation. What they have to do, and it can be difficult to, you got to keep, you've got to separate these ideas in your head. That's what we say publicly, but in real life, because we don't want our own citizens killed, or, I won't go down that road, we've got to actually focus on the real threat, which is ISIS-K, which is Afghanistan. So difficult to say how the FSB approaches this, and I think they are, the two reasons that they're talking about Ukraine, the United States, et cetera, In fact, they were just statements overnight from the foreign ministry, the press spokesperson, Maria Zaharova, that, and others, that the United States, by trying to direct attention away from Ukraine's role in this terrorist plot, is covering up its own tracks on its role in this terrorist attack. And I guarantee you, the United States did not sponsor or have anything to do. We tried to stop this. But when you're dealing with a government that will turn anything, even a terrorist attack on its own citizens, to its priorities, the priority of the state, which is victory in Ukraine, that's what you do. Difficult to run a government that way.
Let me ask a kind of bigger picture, or stepping back in time a little bit. When you were ambassador, the U.S. was famously in sort of, the midst of the pivot away from the Middle East and toward Asia, which I think not necessarily intentionally, but had the consequence of putting both the Arab-Israeli conflict and terrorism, counterterrorism issues a little bit on the back burner. Given events in the meantime, do you think that was a mistake?
Well, I'll tell you, it was certainly, so as the professor mentioned, I served in both the Trump administration and then 2 years after that in the Biden administration. So I'll focus on the Biden administration, the Biden approach to Russia, particularly in the first year of the Biden administration. It is the case, and actually the U.S. national security strategy, whether it's even under Trump or Biden, the principal security challenge, and its various scary terms that are used, the generational challenge, the really big deal, is the competition with the People's Republic of China. And then there's Russia. Russia's always number 2 or 1B, because Russia has got the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons, strategic and non-strategic, in the world, in a large army, in a government that's willing to do things that most governments are not. For the Biden administration really wanted to pivot to Asia, and also, I mean, to a lesser extent, Eurasia. But I'll give you a very concrete example and how the White House structured itself. The National Security Council, the president appointed a so-called coordinator for Asia, Kurt Campbell, who's now the Deputy Secretary of State. And Kurt was the person in the administration for Asia. I mean, not my friend, Assistant Secretary Brink, who's the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific at the State Department. It was Kurt, and it was Asia. For Europe or for Russia, no coordinator. In fact, this is at the start of the administration, it took months to get, and this is NSC nomenclature, I'm sorry to bore you with it, but it ultimately matters in policy. So you got a big cheese who's the coordinator for Asia, and you have nobody in place for Europe and Russia, right? And ultimately, a friend of mine, a foreign service officer, a senior foreign service officer, detailed to the White House, became the senior director for Russia. My impression as ambassador, and I'm grateful for the president to keeping me as his ambassador, but I interpreted my charge as ambassador to keep Russia in a box. Just make them stop. They just cause us problems all over the world. We want to focus on Asia. Please, ambassador, call the White House with a problem. Oh God, the guy from Moscow again. Please, we're focused on Beijing, we're focused on AUKUS, we're doing all this stuff. And it's reflected when Biden meets with Putin in June of 2021. And this is a key point in the history of what happened, including the war in Ukraine. So it's kind of a rocky start to US-Russia relations in 2020. Biden calls Putin a killer. Putin recalls his ambassador. I'm told by the Russians to go home. And Biden and Putin ultimately agreed to a summit meeting in Geneva in June of 21. And I accompanied the president, was at the meeting when he met with Putin. And our talking points, the US government position, bottom line position was, we said this all the time, we wanted guardrails on the US-Russia relationship, like keep things in the road, right? We got big issues we want to tackle, whether it's our competition with China, climate change, you name it. Russia, it's like, get out of me, get away from me, kid, you bother me. I mean, just cut it out. And Putin's just not going gently into the night, right? I mean, he's got ideas himself about what he wants, and his ideas involve the Ruski Mir and his imperial ambitions, not just for Ukraine, but elsewhere in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. So Biden and Putin meet. Biden's, in his mind, is thinking guardrails, let's keep, and he says this to me, keep this, keep the US-Russia relationship in the road. Don't let Putin start a war in Ukraine, Mr. Ambassador. He didn't say that. You know why? Because Ukraine was hardly discussed in June of 2021. Think about that. What, 8 months later, a lot less than a year later, Putin is going to claim an existential threat to Russia, which causes him to launch a major war in Europe. He has the opportunity to discuss it with the President of the United States in June of 2021, and he doesn't use that opportunity. Why? My opinion, he'd already decided to do it. There wasn't anything to discuss. What they did spend a lot of time talking about, U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was, it had been announced, we were planning it. We talked about climate change, talked about wrongfully detained Americans in Russia, hardly anything, a few sentences about Ukraine. So we come out of this meeting, and Biden's relatively pleased. He's not hopeful and expectant of what's going to happen. But it went about as well as he thought it could. And so we had these dialogues with Russia going for wrongfully detained Americans, climate change, strategic stability talks on arms control, and they all got shut down at the end of October, beginning of November, when U.S. intelligence community had, and these people never have unanimous high confidence in anything, and they were unanimous, highly confident Putin was going to invade Ukraine. And everything else that we were talking about got shut down, and all we did was talk about Ukraine. So, again, apologies for the long-winded answer. Their thought was put guardrails on this, keep it in a box while we deal with the other serious problems, and Putin created a huge problem on the continent of Europe that the world is going to have to deal with for a long time into the future.
To talk about democracy and democracy promotion. This is a record year for elections around the world. Something like 2 billion people are expected to vote. It's primary day here in New York, actually, by the way, not that there's a huge contest.
We had our primary in Maryland not that long ago.
But democracy promotion got a really bad rap after the war in Iraq. And so in your view, and with your sort of long experience in and out of government, how do you think that countries like the US, should they support newer and weaker democracies in the world? If so, how can they do it, especially given kind of the reputation that the US has in the global South?
Yeah, so I distinguish between support and create. It's hard to create a democracy, right? And that's what really gets me, about Ukraine. We have a democracy. The Ukrainians have a democracy. Zelensky was democratically elected. We want to support that democracy. If the Zelensky government were not in place, it was more like the Lukashenko regime in Belarus, the ability of the United States, you mentioned Iraq, Afghanistan, even more calamitous failure. We have in South Vietnam, I mean, one success story, and it's not just the United States, is South Korea. I mean, one hope, not hope, it's one possible outcome for Ukraine is, you know, the permanent frozen conflict on the Korean Peninsula. There still isn't a peace treaty that's concluded the Korean conflict. But to get back to democracy and democracy promotion, one of the elections for this year, of course, happened in Russia last month, and Russia has what they call a managed democracy. And the Russians have, the Putin government has managed the Russian democracy so as to eliminate not just all of his domestic political opposition, but to crush civil society and independent media. So there really there's not the infrastructure for a democracy. And the United States has rightfully opposed that. There's a limit to what we can do. I'll cite an example for what doesn't help. I'll cite an example from the prior administration, which Putin was reelected in March of 2018. My friend, the then National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster, we prepared talking points for a call that President Trump was going to have with President Putin after Putin had been reelected. And some of you may recall seeing this in the press, but the president gets these cards, they're long cards with talking points on them. And the top talking point in bold, all caps, was, "Do not congratulate Putin on the sham election that he just won." And of course, the president says, "Vladimir, what a great win! It's terrific!" So HR is like, "Oh God!" But Trump's point was, and he's not doing this. I mean, his justification, because we're looking at him like, "What up?" And he's like, "How can I not? If I want to get anywhere with this guy in a conversation, in a negotiation, how can I not at least acknowledge that he won?" And, you know, you can acknowledge that he won, but you can't really congratulate him on a Democratic victory because it wasn't. I didn't mention this, but when I was the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, I found myself in Azerbaijan after President Aliyev. It was days after he had been elected with like 98% of the vote. And I was instructed by the ambassador, the State Department, I was going to be the first senior US government official to meet with him, that I had to acknowledge his victory but not congratulate him. It's kind of a tricky thing to do, right? So I get it, but what it did, what Trump said, what that did to, I mean, at a host of levels, the opposition in Russia, our support of democracy programs around the world, the damage that's done to our commitment to democracy by saying something like that to an autocrat, worse than an autocrat, who has, through a managed democracy, finagled to continue to rule the Russian Federation for 5 more years, is so far outweighed by the damage that's done to our commitment as a country and to democracy programs worldwide, and in this particular instance to the Russian opposition, which for years has put their lives on the line to work for democracy in Russia, and many of them have been killed, or, you know, those who survived have had to leave. So it's important for the United States. When we talk about American values, I mean, democracy is at the core of it, right? We're a democratic republic, self-governing peoples. And, you know, all of the good things that flow from that. For international relations, peace among nations. It's only a country like Russia that can mobilize and energize its public to launch an aggressive war. It's hard to do, right? particularly if there is a free press and a political opposition. Look at the criticism of the Bush administration for Operation Iraqi Freedom, right? We can debate that, 2003, invading Iraq, mission accomplished, the whole thing. What's Putin done? Putin, and the parallels, and I'm going to make this short because I got a longer spiel about the parallels between how Putin prepared Russia and Russians and its military and security services to invade Ukraine, and what Putin did internationally with what another European leader did in 1938-39 to prepare to invade Poland, ultimately on September 1st, 1939, Hitler. I mean, the parallels are pretty extraordinary if you think about it, right? I mean, the German justification for invading Poland, Hitler's justification was that there was a phony border in the East created out of a war that Germany didn't lose. Versailles created this artificial boundary that separated, German heartland, Prussian heartland, is now on the wrong side of a border in Poland, and Poles, this is Hitler speaking, Poles are abusing Germans in now what should be German territory, and it's Polish barbarism against ethnic Germans and this phony border, that's among the principal reasons that the Germans invade Poland, justification. Now, there are a whole lot of other justifications for why he wanted to do this, principally related to the Holocaust, Lebensraum, all that. But if you focus just on the war against Poland, and you draw the parallels to what Putin did, think about this. Putin's rationale is, it grows out of the loss in the Cold War, right? A war that, from Putin's perspective, the Soviet Union, and he treats the Soviet Union and Russia as synonymous, that Russia really didn't lose. It was the weak-kneed communists. He blames a lot on the communists, going back to Lenin, on all of the problems that Russia has today. But it was the weak-kneed communists in Moscow who let down the troops on the front lines, which he really considered himself to be, as a KGB lieutenant colonel in Dresden, right? So you've got Corporal Hitler, fighting for the German Imperial Army on the Western Front, who's let down, great stab in the back in Berlin. You've got Lieutenant Colonel Putin, who's let down by Gorbachev and the weak-willed communists in Moscow, who lost the Cold War, and what's the consequence? The internal boundaries of the Soviet Union, including the boundary with Ukraine, became international borders. And who's on the wrong side of that international border with Ukraine now? Russians, his Russians. Just like Hitler talked about his Volk. His Russians are on the wrong side of that phony border created out of a war that we didn't lose, and his goal is to recreate that Ruski Mir, protect those Russians, because what's happening to those Russians? Just as it was Polish barbarism against Germans in Poland, it's Ukrainian barbarism, or the more modern term, it's a Ukrainian genocide. That's his two rationales, Ukrainian genocide against Russians, and the US using Ukraine to start a war against Russia. So it's when you don't have a democracy, and you don't have people who could say, wait a second, the way the International Court of Justice did in March of 2022, a vote of 13-2. Is there a genocide in Ukraine? Hell no. 13 judges, and these aren't all Western judges. In fact, a majority of them are not. The two dissenting judges, the Russian judge and the judge from the PRC. No genocide. But if you can manipulate the press, if you can, for example, make it a crime to call a special military operation a war or an invasion, you know who did that? The Germans. Goebbels issues a decree right before September 1st to the German media that says you cannot use what's going to happen tomorrow in Poland. You cannot use the words war or invasion. This is a military intervention to address the problems that the Poles are creating. A free press, we call it a war. If you're controlled by a dictator, you don't. And it leads to war. And I'll conclude with this observation by Hermann Goering. In captivity at Nuremberg, interviewed in his cell during the trial, the ongoing International Military Tribunal, Goering is interviewed by American psychiatrists and intelligence personnel, and he makes some fascinating statements. He was a very smart man, brave man, homicidal maniac, but a brave man and a smart guy. And he said, you know, most people, whether they're Germans, Russians, Americans, Brits, the average person doesn't want to go to war. You know, and he used the German example. He said, you know, a German farmer in Prussia, why does he want to go to war? The best he can hope for is he comes back in one piece and he goes back to his farm. He has to be talked into it. And what's the way to talk that farmer into it? This is Goering speaking. Tell him there's a threat to his country, and anybody who opposes that threat is unpatriotic and undermining their country. And that's what leadership is called for, and that's what Hitler did, and that's what Putin is doing. And that is why democracy is so important.
I have lots more questions about Russia's position on climate change and vulnerability there too, and AI and lots of other things, but I also want to give our prospective students a chance to ask you whatever is on their mind. So I'm going to open it up to Q&A, and please just tell us your name and throw out your question. We'll start right here.
I apologize. I kissed
No,
the Blarney.
okay.
I kissed the Blarney Stone twice, so can't help myself.
And I guess there are microphones, so yeah, start here in front. Right here.
Okay. Hi, my name is Elena. According to the UN, 1 child is killed and 2 are maimed every 10 minutes in Gaza. Do you think that there's anything the American government can do to prevent an invasion in Rafah? And do we have any chance of what is described by UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese as genocide?
So, I mean, unlike my background when I was present in Moscow and saw what happened in the preparation for and the execution of the special military operation, I am speaking only as somebody who reads the newspapers. My sense is that the Israeli government, and not just Netanyahu, is committed to do this. They're committed to do it with, from their view, as few casualties as possible, but just as, and I won't draw a parallel to Russia and Putin, because October 7th changes the calculus, in my opinion, but I would just make the observation in thinking about the Biden administration, it would be an extraordinary thing, I think, for the Israeli government to surrender its goal and desire to eliminate the Hamas threat that they see focused in Rafah.
Hi, my name is Muna Sultana. I'm a 2024 Pickering Fellow, so I'll be serving as an FSO after graduation. And I wanted to call upon your time as an ambassador, and I was wondering if there were 3 pieces of advice you wish that you knew before your time as an ambassador, or if there are 3 skill sets that you really brought into this role that future diplomats could learn from in this room.
Well, you know, I can tell you, that's a great question, and congratulations, by the way. That's great credit to you, and proud that I consider myself, I still have a State Department ID card. I closely identify with the department, thrilled to have you. And I say that to everybody here, those who want to serve, whether it's the US government or elsewhere in diplomacy and work toward peace. Becoming an ambassador, you know, we have this practice that's developed in the United States of political ambassadors. I was one because I'm not a career Foreign Service officer. So for those of you who don't know, the United States has a professional corps of diplomats known as the Foreign Service. It's sort of a civilian equivalent to the uniformed military. It was actually modeled almost 100 years ago by statute on the Department of the Navy, the Foreign Service, the way it's organized, but civilian diplomatic corps. Probably 60, depending on the administration, 60 to 75% of the ambassadors are from the Foreign Service, right? But 25, 35, depending on the administration, percent are not career diplomats, may have never served in government before. And to help both the career diplomats and the political appointees, the State Department, we have an educational institution, the Foreign Service Institute, has a month-long program, ambassadorial school, it's called informally, to teach people the skills that they need and the information that they need to run a mission, to run an embassy. Because an embassy is not just the State Department, it's the United States, it's all different parts of the US government, Defense Department, Justice Department, Department of Agriculture, Commerce. And it's a hard job. If you want to do it right, and you should because it's important to the United States. I had served for 3 years as the Deputy Secretary of State. I'd served previously at the Defense Department and the Justice Department, working on legal, but still foreign policy and national security issues. I was about as well prepared as a political appointee could be to become ambassador. And granted, I was going to Russia, which is about as difficult a diplomatic post as one can imagine. But I remember sitting, and I went to the ambassadorial seminar because I had issued an order as deputy secretary requiring everybody, you couldn't go to post if you hadn't taken the course. So I had to take it. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is hard. You can really get into trouble. Wow. And I then started to, I just accepted the fact that we have political appointees who become ambassadors. I can't imagine becoming an ambassador and going to even a smaller country, smaller post, without having served previously in government. And you go to a bigger post, and maybe not, I'll give you a couple of examples, maybe not countries with which the United States has a good relationship, and you might not think it's, you could really get into trouble there. Kenya and Thailand. Our embassies in Kenya, our missions in Kenya and Thailand are huge. The importance to the United States of those missions to our policies in Africa and Asia, enormously important. And if you're not paying attention and running that embassy right, it's possible to lose control. And for people, whether it's other cabinet departments or agencies, or even subunits and groups it's possible for things to really get fouled up. I then, having taken this course, I got really scared about, geez, I really got to be on my toes and definitely going to Russia. So when anyone asks me now, gee, if so-and-so was elected, what would you want to be? I'll be an ambassador. I'm like, you can really, if you care, if you want to do a good job and do right by the United States and your president and the foreign policy of the United States, you can really do damage to that if you're not really well prepared. And I'd be terrified to become an ambassador. I had the preparation myself, having been deputy secretary, but even then it was a learning curve. And leading a mission, it's not all, this is even for career officers, there's leadership as well. And what was hard about Russia was we were under duress 24/7. by as hostile a government as you can imagine, without actually being at war with them. I'll give you a sense of that. We had the FSB, which is the Russian security service, has 350,000 employees. It's roughly 10 times the size of the FBI. The FBI is like 35,000, and they're not all special agents. The FSB had 7,000 officers whose sole job was to monitor the US Embassy in Moscow, which meant every person, family member, no matter how young, had to be monitored individually by multiple FSB officers everywhere they went. So it's really oppressive. And the things that they do to us, the harassment and so forth, it's possible for morale to really, take a big hit. And when I arrived as ambassador, we hadn't had a confirmed ambassador in several months, and I was concerned about it. And my strategy was, to sort of approach my colleagues in the country team as, we few, we happy few. We're here at the, Fort U.S. Embassy in Moscow, surrounded by this hostile host government, and we're going to give it back to them, right? We're just not going to take it. And the Russian harassment, and I won't bore you with the details, but there were ways for us to push back and to make life difficult for them, which we're always reluctant to do, because it's not that we're nice people, but you really have to think and act the way they do to get as nasty. You have to try. And I said, you know what, we're going to try on our own and push back against them. So here's how does morale figure into that? So I'm laying this out for the country team when we're debating things we're going to do. And I say, you know what, we're going to give this new policy a name. And they're like, okay, yeah. I said, Operation Twisted Sister. I get a few chuckles, right? Those of us who are old enough to remember the rock band Twisted Sister and their song, "We're not gonna take it." No, and like people are like sitting around like, "We're not gonna take it." No, hell no. So for example, one of my colleagues, she went to the grocery store. This is after the war started. And the FSB tailed her. And while she was doing her grocery shop, she had a white sedan. FSB tails her, has black electrical tape, tapes a Z, the Z, which is the Russian symbol for the special military, tapes a Z to the roof of her car, which she doesn't see when she comes back. They have multiple drones overhead. I mean, this is a government operation. This isn't just some kids trying to have, on a lark. They videotape her driving from the grocery store back to the US Embassy. They put it on social media and the evening news and joke about, hey, look, even the US Embassy is supporting the special military operation. See, they've got Zeds on their cars. So the person who this happened to, we met, but by God, we're just not going to take it anymore. So we didn't start taping, I don't know what we would have taped. But having laid the groundwork for, yeah, they're punching us, but we're punching back, it's sort of, it was my effort to try to keep morale up, to recognize that we were making a sacrifice and we were getting battered about by the Russians, psychologically, and in some cases physically, altercations getting into the embassy, but that we were going to push back. We were going to stand up for American values, all of that good stuff. And in my opinion, it helped. But there's only so much you can do, and I'll leave you with this one final example. There's only so much you can do to keep morale up when our school bus comes back from the Anglo-American school, which is where most of our family members, the children from the embassy go to school. And the Russian security services had, on a pretext, stopped the school bus. I think it was a broken taillight. And they searched every child on that bus. Their backpacks, patted them down. We're talking 5, 6, 7-year-old children. Even joking about Operation Twisted Sister, when that happens to your child, it's tough to keep morale up, but you do get pissed off at that government.
We have maybe time for one or two more, so yeah, here.
Hi there. My name is Elizabeth Markwick, and I'm actually an intern for the Russia desk at DUS for the past 2 years. So one of the primary things that I've had to do for my job is basically
Clean up the mess I made?
tracking the rhetoric of important Russian officials regarding the war and things like that. And one thing I was just curious is we've seen that Medvedev has talked a lot about nuclear weapons and using that, and sometimes his stuff is typically relegated as very outlandish, but then Lavrov has recently also taken up this line of rhetoric, and obviously he's a more credible government official, I would say. So I'm just curious if you think there's any sort of credibility behind that now that it's not just him putting that out on Twitter.
Yeah, so the nuclear threat, the nuclear saber rattling, that's the Russian government intentionally doing this, and it goes back to the Soviet era. I mean, it's a strength they have, and they use whatever they have for the benefit of the state. Medvedev, there are other reasons why his rhetoric is just over the top. And this is a person who, when he was president of the Russian Federation, when VVP took his sabbatical from 2008 to 2012 and was prime minister, Medvedev became president, and he was perceived in the West as a potential liberal reformer. And Putin has blamed him personally for weakening Russia during the 4 years that he was president. He blames the Western NATO intervention in Libya on Medvedev, his weak Putin. I mean, this is, Putin himself doesn't say this publicly, but it's widely speculated. Putin believes, well, first of all, Medvedev doesn't have a background in the KGB, so he can never, or FSB, he can't really be part of the Chekist cult that Putin has. But he's, Putin thinks, they say Zelensky's a coke addict. He thinks Medvedev is an alcoholic. He's a lawyer, an alcoholic lawyer who never served in the KGB. Weak, worthless. To ingratiate himself, this is all speculation, but we Western diplomats, the things the guy says now, it's just over the top. He describes, when he refers to the United States and the United Kingdom, and he likes to refer to us as a pair, he describes us as the Anglo-Saxon perverts. I mean, what? You talk about lack of diplomacy. He said after the war started that we should padlock the embassies and only look at each other through binoculars and gun sights. So his rhetoric, there's a domestic political aspect to this and a rehabilitation of Medvedev is to try to rehabilitate himself as a tough guy. I don't think he's succeeding. But the nuclear threat, the threat of nuclear war is something that everyone from Putin on down raises, and they have raised. And I'll cite one example. This is before the war started. After the war started, Putin raises nuclear weapons all the time in ways that a US president never, ever, ever would. And it goes down the hierarchy. So we're engaged with the Russian Foreign Ministry in December of 21 to try to address the Russian security concerns. They wanted security guarantees. And this is, so June of 21, no mention of the need for security guarantees. An existential crisis in November and December of 21 for the Russians. They need written security guarantees from the United States and NATO instantly because Russia is, continued existence is threatened. And I'm engaged in a conversation with a Russian deputy foreign minister who I still consider a friend, Sergei Ryabkov, deputy foreign minister. And from his talking points, he said to me, if we don't get these guarantees, I mean, the next thing you know, John, it's going to be like the Caribbean crisis. Now, I'd been in Russia long enough to know. For those of you who don't know what the Caribbean crisis is, that's what the Russians call the Cuban Missile Crisis. because it wasn't a crisis about Russian missiles in Cuba. It was a Caribbean crisis that the United States had really started. Anyway, so I knew he's saying it's like the missiles of October in 1962. And I said to him, Sergei, we were talking about Ukraine and the Minsk agreements like 90 seconds ago. And you've now gone from 0 to 60, and you're talking about nuclear war between, how can you do that? And he would, you know, he had instructions of what to read. I didn't, and as you can tell, I speak my mind. So I said to him, you know, if I did what you just did, unless I was instructed by Washington, if I raised the prospect of nuclear war in a discussion on any topic with any other government, the President of the United States, as ambassador, would recall me, fire me, and suggest I have my head examined because that's nuts. But you know what? When you're in a weakened position, as Russia is strategically against the United States, the Russians will tell me all the time, look, we understand the Russian Federation isn't the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was. You're stronger than us economically. We got that. We're rebuilding our military. We've got these new weapon systems, hypersonics, the new SARMAT, ICBM. So when you got nukes, I'm not saying he wants to use them, but he's going to use them to pressure us. He wants to put us on our back foot. He wants the Biden administration to self-deter on supporting Ukraine. And what are the tools he has? Among them is his massive stockpile of non-strategic nuclear weapons in particular, which aren't regulated by any arms control agreement. The New START Treaty addresses strategic delivery systems with warheads. The Russians won't acknowledge, and I've asked many times, won't tell anybody or the world how many non-strategic nuclear weapons they have. So it's just the way they do business. So that's, when Medvedev says that, he's under instruction. When he calls us the Anglo-Saxon perverts, that's to a domestic audience, including his boss, Vova, in the Kremlin, to try the impossible task of getting back in his good graces.
So I promised that I would keep us to time and not stand in the way of happy hour, so I'm going to wrap it up, but I've got a very short question,
Sure.
which is, at ambassador school,
Yes.
did they tell you how to acknowledge an election without congratulating somebody on winning it?
You know,
What's the verb that you use in that sentence?
you know, that's no.
I
And
hear you
it's
won.
yeah, I hear you won. What you don't say is what President Trump's, this was to President Xi, where there were changes in the Chinese Communist Party's rules, and Xi could serve for more than 2 5-year terms. And Trump said to him, "Hey, that's great, congratulations. We should have that here." That's
not what you
the
said.
example
Okay.
of don't say this. So.
Well, thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
sharing your stories with us.